Daily Words of God. What of the suffering that God experiences when He becomes flesh and lives among mankind? What is this suffering? Does anyone truly understand? Some people say that God suffers greatly, that although He is God Himself, people do not understand His essence, but tend always to treat Him like a person, causing Him to feel aggrieved and wronged. They say that for these reasons, God's suffering truly is great. Other people say that God is innocent and without sin, but that He suffers in the same way as mankind, that He suffers persecution, slander, and indignities alongside mankind. They say He also endures the misunderstandings and the disobedience of His followers. Thus, they say that God's suffering truly cannot be measured. Now, it seems that you do not truly understand God. In fact, this suffering you speak of does not count as true suffering for God, because there is suffering greater than this. Then what is true suffering for God Himself? What is true suffering for God's incarnate flesh? For God, mankind not understanding Him does not count as suffering, and neither does people having some misunderstanding of God and not seeing Him as God count as suffering. However, people often feel that God must have suffered great injustice, that during the time that God spends in the flesh, He cannot show His person to mankind and allow people to see His greatness, and that God is humbly hiding in an insignificant flesh, and that this must be a great torment for Him. People take to heart what they can understand and what they can see of God's suffering, and project all sorts of sympathy on God, and often will even offer a little praise for His suffering. In reality, there is a difference. There is a gap between what people understand of God's suffering and what He truly feels. I am telling you the truth. For God, no matter whether it be God's Spirit or God's incarnate flesh, the suffering described above is not true suffering. Then what is it that God actually suffers? Let us talk about God's suffering only from the perspective of God incarnate. When God becomes flesh, turning into an average, normal person, living side by side with people among mankind, can He not see and feel people's methods, laws, and philosophies for living? How do these methods and laws for living make Him feel? Does He feel loathing in His heart? Why would He feel loathing? What are mankind's methods and laws for living? What principles are they rooted in? What are they based on? Mankind's methods, laws, and so on as they relate to the way to live. All of this is created on the basis of Satan's logic, knowledge, and philosophy. Humans living under these types of laws have no humanity, no truth. They all defy the truth and are hostile to God. If we take a look at God's essence, we see that His essence is exactly the opposite of Satan's logic, knowledge, and philosophy. His essence is full of righteousness, truth, and holiness, and other realities of all positive things. What does God, who possesses this essence and lives among such a mankind, feel? What does He feel in His heart? Is it not full of pain? His heart is in pain, a pain that no person can understand or experience. This is because everything that he faces, encounters, hears, sees, and experiences is all mankind's corruption, evil, and their rebellion against and resistance to the truth. All that comes from humans is the source of his suffering. That is to say, because his essence is not the same as corrupt humans, the corruption of humans becomes the source of his greatest suffering. When God becomes flesh, is he able to find someone who shares a common language with him? Such a person cannot be found among mankind. No one can be found who can communicate with or who can have this exchange with God. What kind of feeling would you say God has about this? The things that people discuss, love, pursue, and long for all have to do with sin and evil tendencies. When God faces all of this, is it not like a knife to his heart? Faced with these things, could he have joy in his heart? Could he find consolation? Those who are living with him are humans full of rebelliousness and evil. How could his heart not suffer? How great really is this suffering, and who cares about it? Who takes heed, and who is capable of appreciating it? People have no way of understanding God's heart. His suffering is something that people are particularly unable to appreciate, and humanity's coldness and numbness deepens God's suffering even more. There are some people who often sympathize with Christ's plight because there is a verse in the Bible that reads, "The foxes have holes and the birds have nests, but the Son of Man has not where to lay his head." When people hear this, they take it to heart and believe that this is the greatest suffering that God endures, and the greatest suffering that Christ endures. Now, looking at it from the perspective of the facts, is that the case? No, God does not believe these difficulties to be suffering. He has never cried out against injustice because of his difficulties of the flesh, and he has never made humans repay or reward him with anything. However, when he witnesses everything about mankind, and the corrupt lives and the evil of corrupt humans, when he witnesses that mankind is in Satan's grasp and imprisoned by Satan and cannot escape, that people living in sin do not know what the truth is, he cannot tolerate all of these sins. His loathing of humans increases by the day, but he has to endure all of this. This is God's great suffering. God cannot fully express even the voice of his heart or his emotions among his followers, and no one among his followers can truly understand his suffering. No one even tries to understand or to comfort his heart, which endures this suffering day after day, year after year, and time again. What do you see in all of this? God does not require anything of humans in return for what he has given. But because of God's essence, he absolutely cannot tolerate mankind's evil, corruption, and sin, and instead feels extreme loathing and hatred, which leads to God's heart and his flesh enduring unending suffering. Have you seen this? Most likely, none of you could see this, because none of you can truly understand God. Over time, you should gradually experience it for yourselves.